pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I have a friend who is a big fan of AI, artificial intelligence. Now, I have kind of a vague idea about neural networks and some of the advances that we've had lately in computer technology, and I do have a free ChatGPT account, and sometimes I'll log in and I'll talk with the AI. It gets a little lonely out in the parsonage. I'm just kidding. And it is really interesting how it responds. It really does sound like you're talking to a person most of the time. But I've never really made much use of it. But my friend, he is a big proponent of it. He uses it all the time. He uses it to help him write things and all sorts of stuff like that. And this last week, he had AI write him a sermon on empathy, which he then sent to me. And I read it, and it was pretty good. So then I made a pivotal mistake. And I put my Bible text in for today and asked it to write a sermon for me. And it very quickly spit one out. I did find a few issues with it, and I mentioned that to the AI, and it gave me two alternatives correcting the problem that I had. And both alternatives were pretty good. My mistake was that I have no intention of using it, and now I have to kind of pretend like I didn't read it. Because it was pretty good, so there are many of its ideas that still might work their way into today's message, despite my attempts to do otherwise. So the good news is, consistory, I found a way for the church to reduce our budget. The bad news is it involves replacing me with AI. But I digress. Today's passage contains at least a couple important themes. And the one I want to focus on is, what is the point of all this? What is the point of Christianity? Why do we come to church? Why do we have faith? Our reading for this morning comes to us from Luke chapter 6. This passage contains 3 different vignettes. The first 2 stories involve Sabbath observances, and the third story involves the call of the 12 apostles. Now, the first 2 stories take place on a Sabbath. And that's sometime between Friday sundown and Saturday sundown. The Torah indicates that people aren't to work on that day. And the Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay, I saw this one of you caught what I did. I tried to leave out Leviticus because nobody likes to read that book, but that's the 5th book that's right in the middle. So that's the Torah. And in fact, observing the Sabbath is even one of the 10 commandments. So it's a big deal. The Sabbath is supposed to be a day devoted to rest and religious observance. Now, unfortunately, the Torah itself doesn't define what work means. And if any of you have worked in this area of like law or religion or any of that stuff, definitions are important. So the rabbis have had to fashion a number of rules to guide people in being faithful to the commandment to observe the Sabbath. And there's, of course, a very healthy debate in Judaism about what was and what is not permitted on the Sabbath day. In the first story, Jesus and his disciples are walking through the fields of grain on a Sabbath day. As they're passing by, the disciples pluck some heads of grain and ate them. Some Pharisees saw them doing this and pointed out that it is unlawful to work on the Sabbath. Harvesting food is not normally something you're allowed to do on the Sabbath. It's considered work. In response, Jesus references a biblical precedent where biblical laws can be set aside to meet a human need. The second incident is similar. Jesus is in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. There's a man there with a withered hand who Jesus heals. Now, Jesus' occupation could be seen as a healer, which would mean healing on the Sabbath is not permitted. Now, it would be different if someone's life was in danger, because, of course, the rabbis are all in agreement that pretty much any law can be set aside to save life. But this is one of those gray areas. Well, can you heal a withered hand on the Sabbath, especially if you are a healer? Jesus' argument here is that it's permitted to do good on the Sabbath. But his actions only earn him anger from his detractors. And then the last episode starts with Jesus spending the night on the mountain in prayer. When morning breaks, he comes down and he chooses his 12 apostles. And then the text ends with the naming of the 12. Now, it's important to remember, and this is one thing I had to remind the AI about, is that the Pharisees were not a monolithic group. They didn't all believe the same things. So the biblical writers didn't really worry about that subtlety. That was not their concern. Their concern was not to historically accurately reflect the views of all Pharisees. In fact, they're most of the time just setting up Pharisees as Jesus' opponents. But indeed, in the Gospel, some Pharisees are even positively depicted. But we have a tendency to see the Pharisees as hypocritical nitpickers, which is not really a fair thing. It's more of a caricature. For the most part, they were a group of serious, faithful Jews who were really trying to find ways to live in accordance with Torah in a very difficult set of circumstances. In many ways, the Pharisees and Jesus would have been in agreement. Both were concerned about taking the laws of the Torah and finding modern ways of applying them to everyday life. Phariseeism is the ancestor of rabbinical Judaism, which is the ancestor of modern Judaism. So we need to say up front that the Pharisees were a diverse group with a diversity of opinions. Otherwise, we run the risk of painting all Jewish people with broad brushstrokes that are not fair. But what does this all mean? Why do we care? Because in the end, we are here for what we are here for. In fact, what humans exist for is the increase of love of God and the love of neighbor. UCC theologian H. Richard Niebuhr says as much in his seminal book, The Purpose of the Church and Its Ministry. It all boils down to that. Do your beliefs and your actions serve to increase the love of God and the love of neighbor or not? That's what ultimately is important here. Jesus makes this point by showing that Sabbath observances need to serve the needs of human beings. They don't exist just for themselves. Hungry people should be able to eat, even if it means grabbing a few heads of grain in the fields. Sick or injured people should be able to be healed, even if the healer is doing his job on the Sabbath. That's what this is all about. Increasing love for God, increasing love for neighbor. In service to that end, most, if not all, rules can be bent or even broken. We can't let anything get in the way of that sacred vocation of love of God and love of neighbor. What rules, what traditions are we putting in the way of love? Now, those traditions that were being argued for back in Jesus' day existed for a good reason. They were trying to preserve the sanctity of the Sabbath. But we can't let those kinds of things get in the way of love. Now, one of my concerns about talking about the Pharisees in the Bible is that we often kind of think about them as being somewhat different than us. But the truth is, so many of us, we can also be like that. We can get fixated on certain rules and how things need to be done, and forgetting what the real point of it all is. I mean, you guys, many of you have been part of church for a long time. Some of you have been in church meetings where we have arguments about very mundane details. And that's true of all churches, not just ours. And that's because we lose sight of what's really important. We get fixated on certain details, certain traditions, certain rules. And we forget what's really important, the love of God and the love of neighbor. And we all fall into that trap. Believe me, as a pastor, it is very easy to fall in that trap because part of my job is kind of upholding rules. I don't like to think about it that way, but I'm sure the kids in confirmation would say, Chris, that's what you do. Thanks, kids. Thanks for reminding me of that. Trying not to be the grown-up heavy, but I want to be cool. Come on, can I be cool? No, I can't be. But it's so easy to lose track of that. What's really important. It's easy to ridicule Jesus' opponents because it looks like they are nitpicking about minutia when they should be more concerned about human need. But again, we aren't a whole lot different than that. How often do we let our religious traditions, our laws, our regulations get in the way of actually helping people? We do it a lot. But I think that is the point that Jesus is trying to make here in this text. These rules, these traditions, they are important. They do exist for a purpose, for a real good reason. But they always need to be contextualized in the sense of what is most important here. Love of God and love of neighbor. So as we go out into this world, as we think about our own actions, about our own traditions, our own ways of doing things, do they help us increase the love of God and neighbor, or do they get in the way? And if they get in the way, maybe it's time for us to put some of those things aside and formulate new traditions, new rules that do a better job of loving God and loving neighbor.